Hey friends, the thing about stats, there's a couple important things we need to know before we look at them. Number one, stats are an indication of what is, not necessarily what should be or what could be, right? They're a snapshot of what is current reality, but we can also recognize as people that like to change reality, change culture, change the story of our students, that there might be an opportunity to evaluate these things. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing when we think about stats is that it is a snapshot of a sample size. So the way that statistics and surveys work is you take a snapshot of a particular population, in this case Gen Z. This is going to be Canadian and probably a little bit of US students mixed in. But if your context and your students are aspiring bullfighters from southern Manitoba, then that's a pretty sliver, tiny little group of students that might have different ideas than the general sample of the world around them. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So with that being said, though, if you are in whatever community and you've got a unique group of students, it's probably also true that the population around them are likely more like the rest of the teenagers in North America, because the students that you have in your community are watching the same YouTube channels, they're seeing the same people on social, and so the idea that your community would be dramatically different is probably less true these days than it's ever been. Although the unique small group of students that you get to minister to could be a little bit different than this sample size, okay? So far, so good? One last thing before we take a look at these stats. A number of years ago, Tim Keller was interviewed by Carey Nieuwhof on the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast, wonderful leadership podcast, and Tim Keller was so insightful to say, the way that we communicate the gospel, the way that we talk about faith, should shift and change as people and our culture shift and change. Not that the gospel message has to be different, but what he was referencing is that so often in our ministries, we've caught hold of the same program, the same style of message that's been used for decades, and haven't yet been able to veer off the path a little bit to acknowledge the change in culture. He referenced the fact that we talk often about faith the same way that Billy Graham talked about it in the Crusades. And the way that Billy Graham would present the gospel is oftentimes in our churches and our ministries the way that we do. And he advocated for adjusting how we talk about things in order that we could actually be heard by a generation. So keep that in mind as we take a look at the screen for a few things on Gen Z or Z. Either which one. All right, here's a snapshot. 2/3 of Gen Zers believe it is no longer acceptable for companies to be silent on social justice issues. What does that mean for us? Well, we're not a company, but we are an organization, and in light of the fact that our students want big organizations to take stands, they're probably looking for us to articulate the same thing. 7 in 10 want the companies they support to be actively engaged in conversations about social justice issues. Which social justice issues? Probably have to ask them, and they will probably tell you. All right, next up, 32 of Gen Zers have taken at least one of 4 actions. So one of the 4, donating money, contacting an elected official, volunteering, or attending a rally to help address climate change in the last year. It doesn't matter what you think about climate change. It doesn't matter what your opinions are. If you're students, and you've got students in your community that are dramatically fascinated by this new movement, then likely it's worth a conversation. And if part of your rhythm in your ministry is to burn styrofoam out back in the barrel and make it, hey, I'm not here to cast judgment on you, but if the students in your community are casting judgment, it's just important to recognize what they're thinking. All right, next up. The vast majority of Gen Z supports Black Lives Matter and took at least one action related to the recent protests. 12% attended the protest, and then lots posted to social. Lots have made an effort to learn more about actions they can take to support racial justice, and 22% say they've not taken any action related to the protest. Again, same thing. It doesn't matter what your experience and what your thoughts and what your values, what your politics are. When we look at a generation, they have a specific frame of reference. We should know that. And that's going to affect how we pastor and shepherd our students. And it should caution you in how you communicate about some of these things, because without realizing it, you could be adding stumbling blocks to your students as they are trying to find a movement that they can align themselves with that's going to make a difference in their own world and that they're going to be excited about. You can end up sidelining their ability to communicate or to jump in and be a part of the gospel movement. All right? snapshot here. 81% of Gen Zers think social media gives their generation more of a voice than previous generations, and lots of them felt that peaceful protests and political demonstrations are necessary to create a significant change. I don't know about your upbringing, but I didn't know about elected officials growing up. That wasn't in my wheelhouse, and it didn't seem like that was something that was a priority for my peers, and yet here we are with students that know who got voted in and know who they need to talk to if they want to see this kind of change. And so for lots of us, we've got to figure out what that actually means as we think about our faith and the way that it's meant to actually transform the world around us. 62, last thing, 62% of Gen Zers, they agree they have the potential to impact the world. Isn't that fantastic? But it's also a little bit scary, and it's also a little bit important for us to steward and care the responsibility we have about helping guide them in that journey. So, this Gen Z crew, they care about the movements.
They're fun.
What does that mean for us, Lisette? Fill us in.
It's so fun. It's good to watch, right? And I think if you've been paying attention to the news at all, which all of us maybe try to avoid but can't avoid, right? The news is there all the time. There's something that has fascinated me the last few years as we've watched, right? And I would just say all we do is we see these movements, right? We see a lot of movements. You don't have to like them, you don't have to agree with them, you can think whatever you would like to think about them, but between BLM, between Pride, between the women's movement, the climate movement, there's probably a whole lot of other movements. I would say this feels like the generation of the movement, right? We are watching them engage this. And if you go look at the photos of the movements, and I think we have a few photos up there, the amount of movements that have young people at the front of those photos is pretty wild to watch. And I was interested as I was paying attention to this and wondering what this meant for us as a church. I started to think about the new research that Fuller Youth Institute just released in the last little bit. And so they researched and spent a lot of time with a bunch of young people, and they would say there's 3 important questions every young person is asking. Who am I? Where do I belong? And how do I make a difference in the world? Who am I? Where do I belong? And how do I make a difference in the world? And I kind of remember hearing this and thinking, like, I think all of us are asking these questions, right? Like, we are all here. And they would just say, yeah, we all ask these questions, but for a young person, this feels like it's on high alert all the time. And what's interesting is as I think about these movements, what does a young person find? They immediately find identity in that movement, they immediately find belonging, and they immediately find a way to make a difference in the world. And so I just wonder, what does that mean for us as a church? I realize this is really broad strokes, but my sense is we created a pretty consumer model, right? Okay, we did. Right? And I would say we've created a pretty passive church, right? We want them to come, we want them to receive what we have to offer because we have the best thing to offer, and then we would like them to go from there. And so I'm curious what that means for today when we think of our culture, right? I'm curious what that means for us when we think about these questions that Fuller has proposed, right? I think we've done a not bad job of saying, like, who am I? We would say your identity is in Christ, but in the midst of a cultural identity crisis, maybe we should say that a little louder. Then we've maybe told them they belong, right? They get to be a part of something, but I'm curious if the purpose, like how do I make a difference in the world, if maybe that in a consumer, passive church culture has actually been lost, but then we have a generation going to find it, right?